Our next session is Laina Lockett. Laina is an educational developer, STEM education specialist at the Stearns Center for Teaching and Learning at George Mason University. She is going to present a session on rethinking assessment in the era of generative AI. So please welcome Laina.
Hi, everyone. I feel like it's the last session of the day pretty much, so we can go ahead and maybe do a little stretching. And if you're sitting by yourself, I'm going to do the thing that no one wants to do, and I'm going to ask you to sit at a table with someone else. So can we take a couple of seconds to resituate ourselves if we're sitting by ourselves? All right, so my session won't have a ton of content-heavy slides because what I found is AI is always changing, and so I'm not up here to be the holder of all of the information, but rather to facilitate some of the discussions around these topics so we can think about what might the next one step be when it comes to our courses. So, as already said, I work at the Stearns Center, and so I am here to help STEM professionals, and that does include public health, but also I've been doing a lot of the AI programming as well over the last couple of years. All right, so my goals for the next 40 minutes is to give you the opportunity to brainstorm about how your current assessments look and what might be some tweaks that we might want to take now that we have generative AI to consider, and then give you some things to think about when it comes to either creating a new assessment or updating something that you already have, whether that is to incorporate the use of AI, like we saw with some of the virtual reality in the last session, things like that. Or also, there are places, and I think it's important to think about where AI is actually appropriate versus not appropriate, right? All right, so that's what I'm hoping. So we'll start with a quick warm-up dialogue question, and then I'll give you some things to think about when it comes to assessments, and then give you some time to try some things out. So if you have a laptop, we can do that. If you have your phone, we can also use that. And then hopefully we'll have a couple minutes left to kind of share out as a whole room, okay? I know that's ambitious. Usually I have like 90 minutes to 2 hours, but we're going to do the best that we can to get you guys out of here on time. Okay, so the question that we'll start with our warm-up, so it's actually 2 questions, but with the people sitting near you, what is the most important takeaway or skill or maybe outcome that your students learn? And then in your estimation, how well does AI do that thing? All right, so I know for some of our tables with more people, it might not have been quite enough time, but let's come back to the front and let's do just a very low-tech survey just by the raising of our hands. All right, so this is arguably a subjective question, especially with the inclusion of the word well, but how many people said that AI could do that big takeaway well? Did anyone say that? A few? A couple hands? How many said no? How many said, I'm not sure? Okay, so we have a variety of thoughts on that question. So with that in mind, we'll keep going and just give a little bit of context. And I'll talk about some of the things that I think are important to consider when it comes to updating our assessments. And to clarify, when I'm saying assessments, I'm thinking of the high stakes, big cumulative exam or final paper, or kind of like those big things that students often turn in either at like the midpoint or the end of the semester, as opposed to some of those low stakes like homework assignments or things like that, which are really more practice. It's all related and connected, but thinking more of those large stakes as we move through this session. So, AI, as you may have tried out yourself, is really good at doing basic recall. It does hallucinate, but when it comes to those big picture takeaways that you might ask students to do at that recall level, it's generally pretty good. The course I've been teaching for the last couple of semesters is heavily recall, and I think if we're sitting in a space with a lot of recall content in our courses, maybe that's where we want to lean in towards the how do we get students to dig in and do the work themselves versus implementing in the AI. If we are thinking more of some of that creative level stuff, maybe that's the space where we want to start to bring in AI more heavily. And obviously there's a lot of different types of tasks we might do in between. Do you just know the basic foundational definition to the can you now take that and make something new? Now, traditional assessments often rely on that recall space, even if the big picture takeaway that we want students to do might move beyond that space. So, what we want to make sure that we're doing is, as we're thinking about any updates to our assessments that we're making, we want to, understand how well AI can do the task. So if we haven't tried the task with the AI, I do want to encourage you to actually just put in the instructions and see what it does. And then also think about, if we do want to incorporate AI into our courses, are we making sure that students are still meeting those competencies, those learning outcomes for our course, and that it's not actually interfering with our ability to be able to assess the true learning going on? Okay, so I started to talk about this a little bit. We have this thing called Bloom's taxonomy, and so this is just a very simple hierarchy of how learning happens. It doesn't include everything, right? So it doesn't include some of those like tactile skills that we might have our students learn in like a lab. It also doesn't really teach those soft skills, right? It doesn't really talk about those things. But as far as just simple facts and things like that, it really thinks about how they go from being able to memorize something to explain, to calculate, to compare and contrast, etc. And so the way that AI is going to work in these situations, while it always is going to generate some kind of text, at least now as the expert, I feel like the higher it goes up, at least when I think about applications in biology, I think it does a much better job at those basic remember versus the create tasks. And so we might want to lead into that higher space in the analyze, evaluate, and create space if we're thinking about where we might want to bring AI into our assessments, or even some of that practice that they do before we assess them. We might ask them to think about real data sets. We might think about specific conversations that we're having in class. Maybe it's the discussion after going through a case study, for example. And so that would be my thought at this point in the history of AI, right, is that that's a good place to bring AI in, whereas if we're sitting maybe lower in that Bloom's taxonomy, that might be the space where we want to think about how might we update or adapt our assessments so that students aren't trying to rely on AI to do them. How can we get them more engaged in what we're asking them to do? How do we get them to get that buy-in and understanding that they do need that foundational knowledge for themselves to be able to go on and do those higher order thinking skills. All right, so we want to then move on to think about, okay, so if we can place what we want our students to do on that taxonomy, that gives us some space to think about what might be the next step that makes the most sense for our particular outcome that we're thinking about. And then we might think about some of the steps in that process. So if we're thinking more in like a project-based kind of assessment, we might think about, instead of just having them turn in the paper, the analysis at the end of the semester, what are some of the steps that help them get to that final product that we can have those checks and balances. We can ask them to do some more engaging in the material, and we're focusing on asking our students about the process as opposed to the final product. So we might think of this as like scaffolding. And so depending on the topic for your class, this might look very different, right? If we're thinking about health informatics versus something that's more community-based or social work, right? The outcome or what the actual tangible assignments look like might look different, but we can still think about how might we scaffold. That's one of the suggested ways to get students more engaged with doing the work as opposed to just copying in the prompt into AI. And so along with that, we want to make sure that we're being transparent with our students and the expectations that we have for them, right? At George Mason, there's no universal policy. It's up to each instructor to come up with the policy, state the policy, and also remind students of what that policy is, because in every classroom, it's likely to be a little bit different. And then also explaining why we're asking them to do the things that we're asking them to do, relating it back to the skills that they're going to need once they leave the university, but also even just some of the information that's coming out about cognitive decline with over-reliance on AI, right? Like, we want to be at our best if we're helping patients and trying to help the community, right? And so we don't want to be, losing our own capabilities to do the things that we're passionate about. And so we want to be transparent with students with the why and how we ask them to do things, and so we can include that, this called the TILT framework, and so that's where basically you really want to focus on being transparent and explaining those questions to your students. All right, and so again, as part of that TILT framework, we want to make sure that we're showing that alignment to what they're supposed to be getting out of the class. So we might, again, connect those to competencies. We might connect it to the outcomes we have in our syllabus. And so we might think about, as we make those changes, making sure that we're going back to have that alignment with those big picture things that we want our students to get out of our class, whether or not AI can do it well or not. All right, so I was in a session yesterday, and it's still really important to simply start with the conversations with your students, right? Because right now there is no required general education component for students to have about AI. So if we are thinking about having these conversations, incorporating or trying to get students not to over-rely on AI, we just need to start with the conversation. And then talk to them, have them think about how can they be better than the AI, or where is it a place that might be appropriate for it to help, right? Because there are definitely places where AI is beneficial, and there are definitely places where AI is not beneficial, right? And so particularly in public health, we can think about where is that human expertise required, and where is it that we might use the AI to assist. And so when we're thinking about preparing our students to go into their professions, we can also ground ourselves in these questions as well when it comes to making those best choice decisions, right? All right, so the other thing that I want to mention, since this is supposed to be a session on assessment, is what are some alternative things that we can do when it comes to assessments, right? So standard assessments, when I think of that, I think of papers, and I think of exams, and if you're in a high enrollment class, maybe even just a multiple choice exam. But we can think about some less traditional things that we might do. So I've seen in classes as large as 70, where students might take the exam once on their own, but then they're going to work in small groups to take it again. And so if they do better on their own, they get that score. But if they do better as a group, they get an average score, right? So we're not necessarily doing this in all places, but this might be a good way to mix it up and get students, off the computers and into more community involvement when it comes to problem solving, especially if we're doing a lot of cases in our class. This is a great way to get them to actually be assessed on the things that you're having them practice during your regular class sessions. We have online testing. That's definitely much more common now after the pandemic. But then we also might think, if we're doing a lot of this authentic practicing, where they're doing those things that they're going to be doing with their patients or in the community, how might we turn that into the actual final product that they have to turn in, right? And again, that's going to vary depending on your actual class. But how can we have them demonstrate those skills in a way that shows up as a larger portion of the grade, as opposed to relying on it as just maybe an in-class activity or in an asynchronous class, something that they turn in on a discussion board or things like that. How do we shift the weight to the things that are most valuable to them once they leave the university? So something else to think about. All right, so that last one would be the authentic assessment, where we're replicating real life scenarios and using that as the basis of that high stakes assessment, if you will. But we also have this thing called alternative assessment. And so this is the opportunity to get students a little bit more engaged in how they demonstrate their understanding. And so this would be an opportunity for you to come up with a couple of different ways that students might demonstrate their learning and allow them that opportunity to choose what they do to reach that mark. So you might still have the traditional option of taking the test, but you might think of something that's more creative for them to do. Something that I have my students do, not in an alternative assessment, but you might think of how can they pull in other things that they're passionate about. So I work with a lot of design students as an adjunct outside of George Mason, and so I think about how I can bridge the thing that they're passionate about with the thing that they have to learn, right? And where do those two things intersect? And so you might think about asking your students, what are they passionate about outside of your particular class, and are there spaces where there can be some overlap there? Are there some things that they would like to do? Maybe instead of turning in the paper, they can make a podcast, right? There's like infinite possibilities of what an assessment can look like. And so giving them some choice, it doesn't have to mean that we give them all the infinite choices, but maybe we select a couple for them to select from. I was listening to a podcast, and they had kind of like a grid of options, right? So over the course of a semester, they had to, do a certain number of assessments from the list. So they were doing a variety of different things, but they didn't have to do all. I think maybe it was like a 5x5, like a bingo card or something. So they had to do 5, but they didn't have to do all 25, right? And so that also makes it a little bit more fun for you to actually go through and grade. I don't know about you, but I hate reading 100 of the same thing. So it also makes it a little bit more enjoyable, I think, as well for us as instructors to get to see some different things as well. So what if you don't want your students to use AI? Again, I think that's perfectly reasonable, especially when we think about what do we actually have to assess with our student learning. And so you want to think about, is that decision that we're making about using or not using AI, is it that gut reaction like, oh no, I don't want to do it? Or is it this actually is going to harm my students' learning if we use AI here? And I think if it's that second one, that's perfectly reasonable. If not, I'm not saying don't do it because you don't want to, but just make sure that we're making a decision that's going to help our students, right? That's really whose best interest we want to have at the forefront of our mind. All right, so you might also consider asking your students about assignments that they'd be interested in doing. How do they see AI helping their learning? If you make a choice, you might ask them about the use of AI, because actually, believe it or not all students want to use AI all the time. And so learning about your own cohort of students in a particular semester can also help you think about what are going to be some good adjustments to make. And so when we think holistically about our careers as educators, there's often a lot of things that we could do. And so I also just want to caveat that I'm not suggesting that we do everything all at once. And so I like to think about what's one thing on my list that I might implement in a given semester and really focus on doing that one thing. And even if that one thing doesn't go the way that I had hoped, it's just one thing to focus on. And I know that next semester I can try something different. So it's okay to just pick one thing and try it and see how it goes and reassess after that. I also want to encourage you all to talk to each other more than just like at the summit, right? So the technology is going to keep changing, and so we want to make sure that we're continuing to have conversations about what are you doing when it comes to your assessment in AI? What about you? How did that work out for you? And so making sure that we're having those conversations, even if it's in an informal space. So I just have this up here I realize this is also very hard to read on the screen, but it's just if you Google an assessment verb wheel, it'll give you a lot of different ideas of ways that you can assess students depending on learning. And so when you have an idea like, oh, I want my students actually to do the lecture as the end product, the assessment, then I can think about, okay, does it make sense to include AI here or does it not, right? We can think of a lot of the traditional activities that we might do pre-AI and how we might bring AI in as a new step into something we're already doing. So again, making that one easy change to get that practice in before we assess them. So before I move to the next interactive piece, actually, you know what? We'll move to the next interactive piece so we don't run out of time. All right, so like I said, I like to give everyone an opportunity to try something. And so I will just really briefly go over what all of these words say. And everyone here is George Mason, right? We're all, no? Okay, so if you're not George Mason, you can just ignore what I'm going to say for just a couple seconds. George Mason has access to Copilot and Patriot AI, and so if you haven't used that, I would encourage you to use that because that is what has all the security precautions in for George Mason employees. If you aren't from George Mason, I encourage you to double check if you don't already know what systems are in place to protect our use of these types of AI programs. That being said, pick whatever program you prefer. And I want you to take a couple of minutes, maybe not quite 15, but take a couple of minutes and log into your AI of choice and take a few moments to brainstorm what is an alternative way you can assess that big picture thing that we talked about in that warm-up question. So what are some alternative options that you could do to assess your students? So we'll ask AI to do some brainstorming. Once you have a list of a couple options, feel free to ask it for more details. Talk about what it comes up with the people that you're sitting with. So do you like the ideas that AI suggested? Is it something you might actually try? If not, why wouldn't that work for you? And if so, what might be a way to implement it in the fall? And so I did shorten the instructions because we don't have quite 15 minutes. But if you have extra time, feel free to also ask it to make the instructions for you as a draft. All right, I always hate the cutting off of the conversations, but we have about 8 minutes left, and I wanted to open up the floor for an opportunity to either share something interesting, so that could be something like, wow, this is a great idea, or wow, that was not going to work, but it's kind of funny, and I want to share it. So I want to give space to maybe share out if you want to from your prompting, but also open up for you to ask me questions that I will do my best to answer, but can't guarantee I have an answer for. So I will turn it over to you all. If you have a question or a comment, the floor is open. And thank you for handling it.
Hey, thank you. I'm Aaron from the University of Virginia. I just have a comment. This is probably the third time I've used Copilot. I was able to log into our UVA version of Copilot. Well, anyway, I chucked CEIF Competency 13 in there, and it gave me 10 different ways to assess it. And then I added the including instructions and evaluate. So then it wrote out the assignment. It gave me the rubric that I would use to grade it. And then at the end, which the thing that surprised me was that it could align it directly to the CEIF accreditation language if I wanted. So it recognized that it was a CEIF competency, even though I hadn't put that in. So I thought the whole thing was very cool.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Other questions or comments?
I sort of wanted to add two elements to this. As you brought up Bloom's taxonomy. I was thinking about the create. There is a CEIF competency that says create a budget. Right? Budgets can be generalized, and you know the line items. They're very generalized. It's almost a template, right? And I think one of the things we need to think about is, depending on what the assignment or what the competency is perhaps even creating is not enough. We actually have to approach it in a certain way. And a lot of the conversations that I've been hearing around the table is to localize that. So as an example, instead of asking create a budget, say you are a local health department in rural Virginia and your budget has just been cut by 20%. What line items do you cut, right? And that actually changes the assessment to localize it to really a very specific use case where it's no longer a template that you can get online and then just fill in the individual items, but really that critical thinking and that judgment, that human judgment that then has to come in within the context of a really specific use case that LLM isn't necessarily going to be able to copy or do for you.
Yep.
So I just wanted to add that.
Yes, thank you so much for adding that to the conversation. I do think that's a really helpful, important piece to add into the conversation for sure. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I was really interested to see what ChatGPT would come up with in terms of addressing the little bit of elephant in the room in terms of the environmental impact of AI and the individuals, whether faculty, staff, students, don't want to use it for those reasons, which has been a common theme of today's conversation. And so I asked ChatGPT, I framed this problem statement, how do we address that conversation in terms of with your students as an instructor or professor, addressing that environmental sustainability conversation. And so it came back with various ways that you could introduce that discussion with your students with that curiosity mindset. And then it also provided me with relevant CEIF foundational competencies and also then assignment ideas. So not just prompting a dialogue between students and faculty and also among peers in the classroom, but then how to frame that as an assignment to allow the students to take a deeper step and then how to align those with the CEIF competencies. So whether or not this is valid or accurate, I couldn't check that. I'm also not trained in public health. That's not my necessarily field of expertise. But just as as an exercise, I found it really fascinating and really eye-opening too, because in a lot of the conversations, the discussions around the environmental impact, the same framework isn't being brought up by those faculty members or students around energy use or water use, right? And so I think allowing faculty and students do a deeper dive into that, and again, allowing and following the CEIF competencies to do that evidence-based approach, leadership systems thinking, to kind of pressure test some of our biases in terms of the environmental impact, since I'm sure a lot of students may be consumers of fast fashion. They may have a gas-powered car. They, stream services, et cetera, right? But are they applying those same standards they have around AI that's kind of been villainized a little bit in media compared to other consumptions of power and water? So anyway, it was just really fascinating to see ChatGPT coming back with ways to frame the conversation, frame assignments, assessments, to really kind of push individuals to think outside of the box a little bit. So it was a fun exercise, so thank you.
Excellent. I think there's two things, if I can jump off of what you just said. One is, I think, to also remember that just like there's variation between how we as faculty feel about AI, that's also true for our students too. And so Gilbert Gim, some of you all might know him, worked on a project with him looking at those faculty perspectives and how it really did vary between disciplines, even just at George Mason. And then an informal study done by someone on the AI task force here showed that there was that same spread and variability about how much students really felt like they should be using AI. And some of that definitely is tied into those environmental impacts, for sure. And so I think one thing I've been asked recently is, like, can you make a student use AI? And I think it could be helpful. Again, biology, environmental science background, I think back to the frog dissection lab in high school and how there was that optional alternative way for students to achieve that learning goal without actually having to dissect the frog if it really was truly against their values. And so I think that's also something to consider. Like, I think it's fun and innovative to think about how we might use AI someplace in our classroom, but just in the back of our mind know that, we might have a student who doesn't want to do it for ethical reasons. And we might also, for ourselves, have concerns about it. And we might think about how might we implement the use of AI, but also try to reduce the impact as well. Are there places where students can prompt together so that not every student in a 100-person class, right, has to ask the same prompt, right? Are there places where we can think about how the impact is reduced? So thank you for bringing that up.
I think we have time for one more quick comment, question.
Yeah, so it's a comment. So I am from George Mason University, and the prompt that I gave AI, my co-pilot AI, I teach the capstone class. So I said, let's do a critical thinking prompt. And the language it provided me, actually it pointed to connecting it to the Nuventive annual report, so that it's kind of like serves two things: the students' learning outcome, and then also the university requirement for each program providing like the competency for whatever it is that you're teaching. So it's very useful because it recognizes that I've used it obviously for many other things. So it connected the dots and said, hey, you can also think about this other thing. And then the other thing is for assessments, I like the on-ramp. I'm in the 790 class. I use it by creating an agent where I'm actually providing the students the option of using that agent to write the outline for their project. So it will only allow them to progress from step A, B, C. If A is right, then B is right, and, so that everything it cuts down the time, because time is a luxury they don't have. Many of them are working. And so it speeds up, and then they also learn how to use it in a way that I've allowed them to use in the class. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, I don't want to take any more of your time, but thank you all for letting me stand up here and talk you through some things. So thank you very much. Oh.
Thank you, Laina.
One more aside, actually. I take it back, sorry. I do a lot of programs at Stearns. I do 2 mini courses, so if this was something that you enjoyed doing and you're George Mason, it's really easy to register. Just go to the Stearns Center event calendar. I have about 7 slots for the June one and about 3 or 4 slots for the August one. If you don't go to George Mason, but that sounds interesting to you, I'm happy to share my contact information and try to find a roundabout way for you to join. But right now it's not set up for you to be able to register if you're outside of George Mason, but we've done it before where we've had a couple of people join from outside. So that's all. Sorry. Thank you.